Hi, I'm Jaya Aysola, and you're listening to the Post Call podcast.
Welcome to the Post Call podcast by MDedge. Here at MDedge, we know that medicine can be a bit of an awakening at every step of your career, from med school to residency to fellowship and on to practice. This podcast is a place for physicians to draw on the things that motivate them and help you find your truth. So here, we want to share your stories, what you love in medicine, and what you love outside of your career. In today's episode, I talk with Dr. Aysola. Dr. Aysola is an assistant professor of pediatrics at the Perelman School of Medicine in the University of Pennsylvania in the Division of General Internal Medicine. Dr. Aysola recently published research on workplace inclusivity with regard to gender in medicine. Dr. Aysola, I wanted to talk to you based on research that was just published a couple weeks ago, where we look at different discrepancies in the workplace for physicians. And I kind of want to know, just off the top of your head, what did you find and what surprised you?
Okay, so essentially what we found and what we looked for was what defines inclusivity in a workplace organization, or what defines inclusion in a workplace organization. And what we found was, unsurprisingly, that some of the same challenges that we're seeing sort of play out nationwide in other fields are not unique to other industries. They're here as well within the medical institution, and the common challenges that minorities and females may have within the workplace culture in terms of feeling a sense of lack of inclusion or belonging are prevalent here as well. What was surprising for us, or what was surprising for me, was the method we used to try to collect these stories and analyze these stories. I was really surprised, actually, at the appetite for individuals to want to provide those stories. The degree in which people contributed, the pages-long commentary in which they sort of detailed their challenges and their positive examples of inclusion were striking to us. The other part that was somewhat surprising was the sense that sort of sets the stage for the next set of inquiries for us, is the sense that there was this notion or perception of what inclusion was by just the word, and sort of the laden sort of assumptions that comes with that word.
Right.
And so the sense that any effort to sort of include some is at the expense of someone else. And so how do we sort of think about inclusion and diversity efforts and dispel the notion that they're not necessarily zero-sum?
Interesting.
And so this serious voice that, well, if we're asking a question about inclusion, we can't necessarily be talking about a certain person or a certain type of person, is something that came through clear in our study and was surprising to us.
The fact that people wanted to respond in the way that they did makes me think that people are kind of holding back maybe in their personal lives or their professional lives, and given the opportunity to kind of unload, they jumped on it.
Yeah.
And when you read it, I imagine that there is a professional response and then there's a personal response where I'm sure you said, oh, that's nice, or oh, wow, that's not good. And do you have any of those responses off the top of your head where you're like, that stick with you and maybe either motivate you or encourage you or sort of guide you for the next steps?
Absolutely. I mean, obviously, because of sort of the need to preserve anonymity, some of the most powerful responses I can't even allude to.
Sure.
But yeah, there were some that were actually poetic in nature. I mean, they used similes and allegories, and that they quoted like historical references, etc. And it was not only moving and powerful, but it really, the whole team was struck by those, I think, definitely.
That's something that you carry with you probably for a while.
Yeah.
So I found in doing these kind of conversations that the disparities between race, gender, religion, socioeconomic background, they kind of are almost like tattoos. You bring them with you, but if you can get into a place where it's specifically in medicine, it becomes less relevant. I find that most physicians enjoy treating patients. And once that patients become the priority, things can move in a positive direction. But it's the workplace things that I've heard anecdotally where people sort of where it gets a little sticky.
I think that's true to a certain extent. I think our intentions with patient care and with each other are actually well-meaning for the most part, right? I think there's definitely explicit forms of discrimination that clearly we've seen play out everywhere. But I think a lot of this is structural and implicit and unconscious. And it's things that sort of seep into our unconscious and like cultural understandings, et cetera, that allow us to sort of engage with each other in ways that are sort of unbeknownst to us, sort of sending a signal that you don't quite belong here, or we don't see you as fit with us. I think we do that in patient care as well. I mean, there is, when you think about the two prevailing theories why healthcare disparities occur, one of them is at the provider or micro level, where there are unintentional assumptions and implicit assumptions that lead to differences in care.
Yeah.
And so I think it happens in both arenas. And I think we see this play out in other fields when we talk about the criminal justice system and the way policing happens, or when we, talk about other industries. So.
It's weird. I think that there's a fine line that becomes blurred between some kind of uncomfortable symbology and then just blatant discrimination, systemic discrimination. And then even the last step of that, the worst case scenario, is pure racism or sexism, which is I classify personally as malintent. Yeah. But I think a lot of discrimination comes from these, like you mentioned, sort of unconscious, oh, wow, I didn't even realize that this was happening right in front of me. But then there are also the uncomfortable images. Out and about in Philly, I like to say I have my finger on the pulse of medicine in Philly, because I hang out with some residents and some young attendings from all 4 of the major institutions in the area. And they tell me that it's sort of more awkward when you talk about it with your colleagues than if you just kind of keep it to yourself and they don't really know what to do. But they're part of this generation with the Me Too movement. There's a lot of, I guess, triumph happening in the popular zeitgeist, but they're still cognizant of what it could do to their career to make too much noise before they've earned it, which is a really interesting place to be in, I think. I
actually agree with you. So I think we were talking about like sort of that I perhaps appear younger than I look, but essentially, I feel like I trained in a time where that consciousness wasn't there, and so you didn't have that inner struggle within yourself to sort of figure out, okay, is that sort of crossing the line? Like I was used to at the time being one of few. It's interesting, like even up and through, like until college, I was one of like 2 or 3 Indian people at the time in the 70s. There wasn't as many at that time. College, probably the first time I actually saw a whole lot of Indian people. I went to University of Michigan. And go Blue! That's big game. Big game this weekend as we record this. I mean, so I like my parents migrated sort of in the earliest phase of it, like in the late '60s, early '70s, where there wasn't a huge migration of Indian immigrants, and my mom was a physician, so it's not like we were underrepresented in medicine, but what we were underrepresented in was sort of academic faculty at medical institutions. So once I got into medicine, it was not like I saw anyone like myself. Sort of teaching us and training us throughout our educational system. And so it was just commonplace to be to sort of see just the majority culture around you and be trained in that majority culture. And I think there would be slights that we would it was just part of core. And so we didn't even think to challenge them or think to question them in a way that, I think this heightened consciousness is allowing us to at least label them and realize that it could be a problem, and it is a problem. So in some ways, I feel like it's much more challenging, I think, for today's residents when they know that these things should be shifting. The paradigm shift should be happening.
Right.
And it's still, the culture is still dated to when I was training.
I mean, you hear a lot of phrases, the boys club, the old boys club, things like that. But what I find really, I guess, difficult about this is because, like, and this is true, and it mirrors society exactly, where the younger generation, they have it so easy. They have no idea what I went through. This is unbelievable. So by the time one becomes as high up the ladder in their career as they'd like to be, then they're in charge and they have the opportunity to make things equal. Are those people conscious? Because those people are the ones that are in decision-making roles. And how do you think that the message can get through to them? Or is there some sort of like these young people don't know what they're talking about attitude? What's the relationship like between the top and the people who are in the trenches?
Well, there's a generational gap. And sadly, there's not enough individuals, again, in leadership that represent this generation.
Sure.
So there is that gap.
Right.
And so the hope is that as we see more, we see a shift in the generations of those that take over leadership, and a shift in more diversity. You would hope you would see that.
Yeah.
But I think therein lies the problem, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's a sense, I think there is an acknowledgement, though, I have to say, there is an acknowledgement, I think, from leadership here, at least to a certain degree, to support this work, to want to champion this work, and see like there's definitely reason to do this and sort of implement change here at Penn.
Yeah.
And to sort of set the stage or example for other medical institutions. But I think there is a gap there.
Yeah, I think, and it's really interesting too, because our audience at MDedge, for the most part, are what I would say not average, but the general clinician that may be listening from somewhere in Kansas or Washington State or somewhere like that. And the experience that you have at Harvard and Penn, the quote unquote East Coast intellectual academic media elite, versus what someone is seeing boots on the ground might be a little different, but then again, it might not be. I think, if I recall where I'm from in Southwest Wyoming, my family members had 3 abdomen surgeries. All of them were performed by Indian men. And I think which by the way, on a side note, it makes a lot of sense. It makes so much more money in Wyoming, and there's no income tax. Like, why would you not take that job?
Exactly.
But anyway, but it made sense. We're like, well, that's the surgeon, and he's just the surgeon, and okay, whatever. But I'm really fascinated to see if people who are underrepresented, who are not feeling included, if that is true across the different rank and file positions in medicine in North America. And also, I'm kind of curious to see how Europe's handling these kind of issues. Because I think that I would argue that as far as gender anyway, our friends across the pond have had a tougher road than we have.
Yeah. So it's interesting, like, the reason why you see so many Indian American physicians in the U.S. is because in Europe, there's a glass ceiling. There was a glass ceiling historically, and you could not rise to the level of attending. And so, and they call attending like registrar, like I forgot their names for it, but they have like a
something
consultant
super
versus
old,
registrar.
yeah.
Something really cool sounding,
and the chancellor of the department.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm forgetting it off the top of my head right now. But essentially, you would stay in residency phase indefinitely if you were an immigrant from another culture. And so there was definitely a glass ceiling where it was far more of subjective, your career advancement. And I think that's the part that makes that gives us hope when it comes to the U.S. system, because there are so many aspects of what we've done historically that have made this far more objective, and that if you work hard and you do the right thing, you will advance within an organization, right? Like
right.
that is not the same. There's a reason why immigrants come to America.
Land of opportunity, baby.
Exactly. Yeah. And so, like, I mean, Leighton is that. I mean, it sounds sort of, hokey or cheesy or like maybe optimistic to a certain degree, but Leighton, that thing is sort of the fact that even these things, if you look at them and study them, you can create structural fixes
right.
for these sorts of inequities
right.
as well. And what do those look like, or sort of the next entree of where we go with this sort of work. But I think that is possible.
Yeah. I mean, you'd like to think so, right? I mean,
yeah.
that's hopefully what's going to happen. What I find also really interesting about, and I know this is happening in other fields, and I think it's happening in medicine to a large degree. We know that the proportion of medical students who are women is going up, and I think recently past men and not turning back. However, higher up promotions are not the same. Attending like fellowships, residencies are not the same. But I always assume like, all right, well, I mean, more work to do, et cetera. But then I talk to some of the people I'm associated with here in Philly, and they say, well, what actually happens is there are also a portion of women who they get out, they get their residency done, and they don't want to. They want to have a kid, they get married, and they just don't want to. And I don't think it's appropriate to force someone to fight someone else's fight. But at the same time, there is also a huge portion who's held back, or not necessarily, I guess, with malintent held back, but they don't have the same inclusive opportunities.
Yeah.
So I think the conversation is complex.
The conversation is very complex. I think latent in even some of the assumptions we make about the reasons why minorities or women may not want to advance to leadership positions or take on executive leadership roles, therein lies the problem, right? Like we sort of make the assumption that they don't want something before even asking the question, and it's not, sort of not in our conscience to consider certain individuals within an organization as candidates for certain advanced positions within the organization. This plays out in incredible ways. If you look at nursing, which is predominantly women.
Well, it was unbelievable. In the 90s, it was 97%. Crazy.
Now, if you look at the leadership in nursing, like who are chief nursing officers, they're interestingly far more likely to be men in a field saturated by women.
That's true. That's weird. See, I didn't know that statistic. That's in the paper.
No, it's not in the paper, but lies
sure.
Unequal opportunities for advancement is a predominant problem. We see this in pediatrics too. If you look, how are in a subspecialty where you have a greater percentage of females, are the chairs of pediatrics emblematic of that breakdown?
Interesting. Yeah, I think that you hit the nail on the head. I mean, I found in business, I know that there were recent data from Harvard about how women are getting stuck in middle management. There's never nobody's on the board, but they're high up supervisors, but not as high as they can go, which I think is really interesting. But for people who are in their residency, fellowship, and young attendings, do you have any advice for what they can do to better the situation, or do you think we're still in the ask questions phase?
Yeah, I think what emerged for us from this study were potentially some concrete things that people can do. One huge takeaway for us was sort of the power of the bystander in these scenarios. Oftentimes in residency, in a hospital setting, you have unit-based interactions, right? So if the discriminatory comment or statement or offhanded joke is coming from one resident, there's usually an attending, a nurse, there's several witnesses. There's several witnesses who stand in silence, right? Oftentimes when those remarks are coming from patients, there's several witnesses that stand in silence. And so we had examples of both scenarios where someone spoke up on the behalf of that joke and said, hey, this is not accurate. And then we had examples where they didn't speak up, and that was really telling. And so this concept of empowering the silent witness or the bystander, I think, is one of a concrete mechanism to change. I think if we all say we're going to have zero tolerance for something, the chances of us changing the culture around us increases, regardless of who says it. I think those things become easier to start in informal ways. I think, hierarchy plays a huge role in this, depending on who says it, it's always harder, but there's still ways that if everyone says, I don't like this, that even those that are in positions of, that aren't necessarily, they're in positions of leadership will sort of kind of have to be forced to look at their own behavior.
Right, which I think is interesting. So the other thing that you've opened up a can of worms, which is great. This is something we've been attacking for a while on this podcast, which is that the business of medicine has become really weird. We are in the era of Yelp and Google reviews, and patient satisfaction is directly correlated with your bottom line now. And so if the old guy says something super racist and sexist, say something, but you also want him to like you so that you have a job and you get paid. This is a really intense, huge issue when it comes to patient satisfaction scores at hospitals and where the patients are taking their business. And you can see we're in Philly where Penn and Jeff are throwing down by a new territory. There's huge land grabs and people are trying to make money on patient satisfaction. How do you address when things like that happen?
Yeah. So I think sadly, we've had training to address when patients are complaining, when they're angry. We get training in medical school to sort of address all sorts of remarks that patients make and handle different family and social dynamics. I think what we've gotten less training on is what do we do when it's discriminatory remarks? What do we do when the patient says, I don't want to be seen by this resident? What came out from our analysis here was that there was concrete examples of that where the attending said, either we all see you or none of us can see you. And the patient apologized, they moved on. And there were positive stories where it went on and it was fine. And so I think not being afraid to say no and say, this is really about your care. And we're here regardless of our background and culture to provide the optimal care to you, I think is a first step. But I think we need training in that. We need to help physicians approach patients that say that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, and I look at myself as like a business opportunity. I think that patients could go for training because I get this with some of my friends. Say, do you understand that this case that you have, which is really fascinating, I'm glad you like it so that they get good care. It's a big deal to the patient. They're scared. They don't want to be here. They don't want to know what questions to ask, and they're going to say weird stuff. They're freaked out. Yeah. It's like a cat who's taken to the vet. They don't want to be there. If I Googled how to go to the doctor for this, I would like there to be an answer to that. And there really isn't. There isn't. Like, what questions do I ask that are actually relevant? How do I do this?
Clearly, it's slightly tangential from this paper, but more in line with some of the other work I do. But you're right. I'm honed in on the first way you phrase this, where you can't Google how to approach or see the doctor. And what we know is that 88% of the U.S. population doesn't have the health proficiency to engage with this population, engage with our field. In other words, that they don't have the numeracy, literacy, or the navigational skills to engage with healthcare systems in the most proficient way. And so if that's 88%, that means it's sort of, so it's like it is a hard system to interface with. And we need to do better on that front, I think. And I think some of the challenges we have is, there's ways in which you sort of can handle the patient in terms of them coming in and helping them navigate a system like this, in terms of confirming understanding and all those things. But I think we fall behind in that, and that's something we need to improve on for sure. But it's a fascinating other tangent where, there isn't really a roadmap for the patient, nor really the provider to effectively handle complex patient-provider encounters within a healthcare system.
Right, especially you think about what it would be like to see an internist as you are. So I have an internist, and then you go to the internist, and the internist says, okay, this is actually a problem, we're going to refer to you to a specialist. But I thought you were the doctor. I don't understand what's happening. So I'm going to go to this other doctor for this other thing. And that person is even harder to get into because they're a specialist, and they're at a university. Maybe they got to drive. And all of it becomes a burden financially in terms of time and energy and all of that stuff for the patient, but then also for everybody in the healthcare system, right? On the other side, you're like, well, yes, this is how it works. This is what I wanted. I don't want to treat you like a data point, but I believe, based on my decades of training and my $500,000 in debt, that this is the best course of action. Trust me. And I think that the trust is where there could be some improvement, or at least there's the most opportunity.
Yeah, and this ties back, and that statement ties back to sort of the genesis of a lot of this work is like, how do we make our workforce, our frontline workforce, but not only the frontline workforce, but the leadership workforce, the people who are designing the healthcare systems of tomorrow, and the people who are investing in generating the medical knowledge of tomorrow as diverse as they can be, so the system is easier to navigate for all swaths of the population, right? And part of that is, how do you make the environment inclusive enough where that actually happens. And so it's a complex dynamic between how we treat each other and how the patients treat us. And that, I think, in some ways is far more unique to some of the sort of, what you're seeing in the film industry, where there's not this tangible cervix exchange between sort of what's happening there and like the lack of a diversity in something in medicine where it plays such a more salient role in the actual things that we're sort of concretely trying to improve upon in the front line. So this is where you can look at like the business world and get some clues into how do we do this, right? So it could be that that person is the right person for the job, but there's probably other people that are equally as good and they should also have the job as well. The idea is not to, again, replace your executive leadership with women minorities at the expense of no white males. I mean, diversity is diversity in its fullest form. But when you have a performance evaluation or if you evaluate residents and say you evaluate 10 residents, 5 females, 5 males, and the best performance evaluations go to all females, shouldn't that be a red flag? Or the top 5 go to all males? Like that should be a red flag. There's systems in place where you can start to sort of flag things that are problematic and improve upon them. Another structural thing that's often talked about is that classic example. I don't know if you've heard it about the violinists. Have you heard that?
No, I don't think so.
So, in the 1960s, there was no first chair violinist, and there's probably less than 10% female violinists in orchestras. And in the 1970s, they actually made the audition process blind.
Oh,
and
like The Voice.
Like The Voice. It predated The Voice.
Yes.
Exactly.
They stole it and ripped it up.
Yeah. And of course, no one to that point thought, of course, we're assessing, we're doing it by merit base, but, we don't realize the strength and the power of our unconscious biases. And it was amazing. That one intervention increased the number of female violinists by 40%, and then you had your first chair violinist.
Once you had so you're saying that the data show that the experiments show that once there's a fair shake, it's everybody the best one, right? And that lends itself to what we know about meritocracies and what we've known about meritocracies for a long time.
Yeah.
That if everybody gets a fair chance, then it's going to be fine. I think there are times that works and there are times that doesn't. But I think if there was a way to implement that without treating people like they're in the Hunger Games, that'd be nice.
Yes.
You will try. If you can't get this case right, you're out. It's you and the patient that are going to die. But yeah, that's really interesting. I find the same things are true with sports in Hollywood. We're like, why wasn't Dev Patel cast as the guy that Jesse Eisenberg was cast at? Why was it switched? What's happening? That's a whole can of worms too. Like, is society reflective or is it projective? What are we doing? This is true though, right? I mean, these are conversations that have not really been had out in the open ever.
Yes,
we don't know what to do.
And with yes, and with medicine, what we can say, and with Philadelphia, we can say when we don't have an ethnic majority in the city of Philadelphia.
True.
And we have 45 to 46% Black and white, we can easily say that our workforce is not reflective of that, and our providers.
Oh,
not
100%. Yeah, and that's you go into systemic racism and poverty, where you can sort of like go to One Liberty, which is one of the skyscrapers in Philly. You go observe, and you say, well, those are the poor neighborhoods out there. You can tell where there's no interstate and no stuff, and this is where the rich people live, and most of them are white, and so like the you're right, it's not representative anywhere. But I think that the biggest challenge in a place like where I'm from in Wyoming, it's hard to be representative because representative is 87% white.
Well, then it is easier to be
Well,
representative.
that's true. It's easier to be representative. I guess what I mean is that it's easier to be the same sort of representative that a place like Philadelphia would be, right?
Yeah. So that's a larger question that emerges from this, is that not so much from this study, but just sort of this sort of line of inquiry, which is, are we aiming to be reflective of the populations we serve? So, what this means in terms of diversity, what that means is very different for here as compared to Wyoming per se, but what it means to be inclusive, I don't think is not.
That's fair.
And that's where I feel like this is the inclusion set of findings, and this sort of line of inquiry is far more generalizable. Oftentimes, you find that the bias is laden in recruitment. We often think about the pipeline, and we often think that it is a lack of candidates that sort of enter into the field of medicine. But if you look more closely, the bottleneck is actually not at the applicant pool, and the same sort of implicit biases that play a role in evaluations and performance evaluations when someone enters into the workforce play a role in the interview level. And oftentimes the assessments we make are just are laden with affinity biases and anchor biases and all sorts of things that are independent of the candidate's true fit for a residency or for a faculty position, et cetera. And those things are subtle yet really pervasive. And some of the tools, again, from organizational literature, more in the business realm, is how do we ask ourselves those sorts of priming questions after interviews to make sure those things aren't happening.
Right.
But they are pervasive and they do happen. But we often think about, we're the first to think about, well, are we going to diversify at the expense of quality? And we know that after study after study that that's not true.
Yeah.
And so our biases are more, if anything, on the other end of the spectrum, where we, again, are not able to effectively assess women and minority candidates as well as we do white males.
One thing I found about your study that I liked was this use of responses and anecdotal data, because I feel as if science, while awesome, I think it is dangerous to reduce people to data points, which includes professionals, physicians, patients. When you say like, well, 27% of the population is X. Well, that's actually, 400,000 people, and they're not all the same, even though they're the same in this one question. Because your study has some responses and anecdotal data, you get more, even though it's not hard, statistically significant. Nobody said that everybody didn't write the same thing, I'm sure. There are examples of certain things where you can say, this happened to this one person. This doesn't mean it's a fact for everyone, but this thing happened, and this other thing happened, and this other thing happened. And I think that I'm encouraged by that. I think that medicine could benefit from some more anecdotal stuff.
So thank you, but I have to be I'd be remiss if I didn't speak up on the behalf of qualitative researchers everywhere at this point, like Dr. Franbarg, who's the methodologist on this paper as well with us. I think I would have to say, so while it's not quantitative or survey analysis, qualitative analysis is still sort of a science.
Oh, no, don't misunderstand me. Of course.
I know it, but I'd have to say it. And so it is still not necessarily, so the methodology used sort of translates what maybe a one-off comment would be perceived as anecdotal into an aggregate response that is truly empiric.
Like a composite score.
So in essence, so in essence, a narrative or thematic analysis such as this is sort of highlighting in a robust fashion what maybe one comment in a survey may do, one open-ended comment in a survey would do that a Likert scale would not.
Right.
So in other words, I do feel like there is room for this, to your point, and there's room for this sort of analysis, to your point, because of the limitations inherent in trying to quantify factors such as this in a survey format. So when you say 1 to 5, rate how your culture is, 1 to 5, rate how your patient experience is, the challenge with that from an operational perspective is if you give me a rating of 3 and then I get a rating of 3.5 on aggregate for patient experience or for culture or for whatever, what does that mean? Like, what does that mean? And if you start to look, you see, wow, the open-ended comments get under the hood of what that probably means more.
Right.
And so this came after a survey such as that, the diversity engagement survey that was that is sort of recommended by the AAMC for institutions to measure inclusion within their organizations. And it was developed at the University of Massachusetts. But what this shows you is that, well, how, the whys are still unanswered. And so how do we get under the hood of what a 15 in inclusion would mean, or a 15 out of 20 in something would mean?
No, that makes total sense to me, because if you ever go to Amazon, you want to buy something, like you look at the stars, like it has 4.4 stars. Like, let me read the 3 stars.
Exactly.
What are the people that kind of liked it? What do they have to say? Because I know the 1 stars, those people are mad, and the 5-star people are probably related to the person that's selling the product. What do the people in the middle think?
Yeah.
What do they really think? No,
and
really
what does that 3 mean?
Yeah.
Right? And so you can get that 3. So all of our performance incentive surveys are sort of, quantifying sort of trying to quantify these subjective things, or these things that are far more qualitative in nature. And so the comments are what gives you clues for an organization in terms of the direction you need to operationalize to improve, right? Like, so how do we action plan around this? I have to read the comments. And so this study takes what would be an open comments section and makes it a much more robust way of collecting an aggregate set of comments and analyzing them in a way that we can say with like a great degree of assertion that this is a prevailing theme. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, I think that's only asking people their opinions is such a weird place to go in science, and not just in medicine, everywhere. But I think that people are so opinionated. We're all on a spectrum of different opinions about stuff, right? Like I have a real philosophical problem with yes or no questions, because that means by even acknowledging or answering the question, that means that the way that you phrased it accurately does or doesn't represent my opinion. Never had an opinion shorter than 3 pages. How can your question be right or wrong? That's ridiculous. It's absolutely absurd. So I think that, to your point, that's exactly right. Well, on a scale of 1 to 10, what if it's an 8.4, right?
What does that mean?
Why can't I answer that?
Exactly. Or like how if an institution finds themselves on these scales at a 3 and it's below the mean and the mean needs to be a 4.5, how do they improve? Right. How do you improve that number without knowing the details of where that?
I would like to know why they think we suck.
Yeah.
Of course. So you're reading through all the responses, and we talked about this earlier. How did it make you feel? Because there were some, I'm sure, that were encouraging, like you said, and some that were really probably eye-opening. But what did it do to you as an individual to read through those and hear some of the good stuff and some of the bad?
It was hard. Mm-hmm. It was hard. I mean, it wasn't surprising, but I think sometimes to the degree that you heard some responses, you were like, wow, it's none of us were surprised, but it's amazing how you don't have to. I think we're not immune yet. Where you're still make notice. I mean, if you think about the national discourse, things happen every day, but there's still enough out there that still makes you pause, right?
That makes total sense. I just can't imagine how long you did this project where you think, all right, only 10 more things to read today. I hope it doesn't crush my soul before I go to sleep. But I thank you for doing this. It's been a fascinating thing to think about. So now that this is out and done, what's next for you? What was it like for this to be in print? And is this like a big moment for you, or is it just back to the grind?
It felt great. It is a good moment. But I think, like every sort of piece that describes the challenge, the next order is how do you solve that problem? I think if I had to make some concluding remarks, I think the take home for me about this line of inquiry is how do we get our institutions to understand that every voice, perspective at the patient level, at the employee level, at the resident level, at the student level matters. And that whether we're studying here, seeking care here, working here, or advancing the next set of knowledge for tomorrow, like how do we work together effectively and champion every voice? Yeah. And I think there are concrete ways in which we can continue to measure this, to keep us honest. And I think we show a methodology here that is applicable to any organization if they wanted to measure it. And I think there's concrete strategies in which we can restructure ourselves to improve upon it.
Yeah. All right. one last question. What would improvement be?
What would improvement
How would
be?
you define it 2 years, 5 years, 10 years down the road?
I think if we can get to a point where it's sort of like we were at a point where this hadn't raised to a level of consciousness, and now it's raised to a level of consciousness across the nation in different fields, but we don't know what to do. I think the next stage is like, we're conscious now, we see that this is a problem, we get to a point where it's improved enough and there's concrete strategies where we don't have that innate tension that you described in that resident.
And a big thank you to Dr. Aysola for joining the Post Call podcast. You can find links to her academic profile as well as a link to some of her research in the podcast notes. For Dr. Aysola, I'm Nick Andrews, and this is the MDedge Post Call podcast.